A young engineer named Boris Korchilov stood in a narrow steel passageway and stared at a light that should not have existed. It was leaking out from around the sealed door of the reactor compartment, a faint blue shimmer with no lamp behind it and no flame feeding it. The men beside him thought at first that something inside was on fire. It was not fire. It was the air itself, glowing, charged by the invisible radiation pouring off a nuclear reactor that was cooking its way toward disaster. Korchilov was 23 years old. He had finished his naval engineering training only the year before, and in a few minutes he was going to pull on a rubber coat and a gas mask, open that door and walk into the light, knowing it would kill him. Behind him stood the commander of the submarine, Captain First Rank Nikolai Zateyev. The captain looked at the young officer and asked him a plain, terrible question. He asked if Boris understood where he was about to go, and Korchilov answered that he understood, Comrade Captain. Then he went down into the glow. This was the North Atlantic off the southeastern coast of Greenland, shortly after 4 in the morning on the 4th of July, 1961. The submarine under Korchilov's boots was the newest and proudest weapon in the entire Soviet fleet, the first submarine the Soviet Union ever built that combined nuclear power with nuclear missiles. She was less than 2 years into her life, and on this night she was trying to kill every one of the 139 men aboard her. To understand how a rubber coat, a length of pipe and a welding torch came to stand between that crew and a nuclear catastrophe at sea, you have to understand what was happening inside the reactor, and you have to understand something that makes this story even darker than it first appears. The fault that nearly destroyed the ship that night was not born that night, and it was not born at sea. It was built into the submarine months earlier on dry land by men in a hurry, and then it was hidden. Here is what Korchilov was walking toward. A short time earlier, the pressure inside the cooling system of one of the submarine's 2 reactors had fallen to nothing. Not low, 0. A pipe carrying the pressurized water that kept the reactor core from overheating had failed, and the coolant was gone. The men on the reactor watch saw it first. A gauge that should have shown steady, healthy pressure was instead falling toward nothing, and for a moment they must have hoped the instrument was lying to them rather than the pipe. It was not the instrument. The pressure was truly gone, and with it went the one thing holding the core in check. The submarine's automatic safety system did exactly what it was designed to do. It drove the control rods into the core and shut the chain reaction down. The splitting of atoms stopped. And this is the part that most people never learn about a nuclear reactor, the part that makes it so pitiless. Shutting one down does not make it safe. When you stop the chain reaction, you remove the main source of heat, but the core is still packed with the radioactive leftovers of everything it has already burned, and those fragments keep decaying, and decay releases heat. Engineers call it decay heat, and it cannot be switched off. It does not slow down because the reactor is shut down. It does not care about the crew. It simply keeps coming. And if there is no water moving through the core to carry it away, the temperature climbs and climbs until the fuel itself begins to melt. That is what was unfolding inside this submarine. The chain reaction was finished. The heat was not. With no coolant flowing, the temperature of the core climbed past 200 degrees, past 400, and kept rising toward 800 degrees Celsius, which is roughly 1,470 degrees Fahrenheit, approaching the point where the fuel rods themselves would turn to liquid. If they did, the core would burn down through everything meant to contain it. In the best case, the boat would be lost. In the worst case, the reactor could tear itself apart in a violent steam explosion, ripping open a hull that also carried 3 nuclear-armed ballistic missiles in the open ocean at the height of the Cold War, only a few hundred miles from coastlines watched over by American and Allied forces, and the crew could not even call for help. A separate breakdown had already crippled the submarine's long-range radio. They could not reach Moscow. They could not reach their own fleet. They were alone under the surface with a reactor climbing toward meltdown and no way to tell a living soul it was happening. Everything the submarine was designed to do about this had already been done. The reactor had shut down on its own. The control rods were fully inserted, the alarms had sounded, and none of it changed a thing because the one system that could actually save them, a backup way to push water through that core, did not exist aboard the boat. It had been part of the design. It had never been installed, so the crew was left holding a problem no manual described. A reactor they could not cool. a radio they could not use, and a temperature gauge with a needle that would not stop climbing. Raising the pressure by hand did nothing. Waiting did nothing except let the number grow. There was no clever tool waiting in a locker. There was only the reactor, the heat, and the men standing at a door that glowed blue. Before we go any further into that compartment, let me ask you for one small thing. This channel is a small Cold War history project, and lately the reach has dropped off sharply. If deep, carefully researched stories like this one are worth your time, the single most useful thing you can do is subscribe. Leave a comment, even a single word, and share this video with someone who loves this era. Every like, every comment, every share tells the system this work deserves to be seen, and that is the only reason a channel this size can keep making documentaries this detailed. It costs you a few seconds. It keeps this going. Thank you. Now, back to the North Atlantic. Here is what sets the story of this submarine apart from almost any other disaster at sea. The thing that finally stopped that reactor from melting was not a machine. It was not a rescue ship appearing over the horizon. It was not some secret piece of Soviet engineering held in reserve for exactly this moment. It was 8 men, a torch, a scrap of pipe, and the willingness to walk into a dose of radiation they knew would end their lives. The solution was human bodies, spent the way a gunner spends ammunition. And the closer you look, the crueler the shape of it becomes. Because the flaw that doomed that reactor in the middle of the ocean had been welded into the boat long before, on land, in peacetime, by workers racing to meet a deadline handed down from far away. The men who created the fault would never feel it. The men who inherited it would pay for it with their lives. To see how it got there, we have to go back to the beginning of this submarine, to a country in a desperate hurry, and to a boat that seemed cursed before she ever touched the water. In the late 1950s, the Soviet Union believed it was losing a race it could not afford to lose. The United States had put the world's first nuclear-powered submarine to sea in 1954. American designers were building boats that could stay under the surface for weeks, silent and hidden, and they were beginning to imagine putting nuclear missiles inside them. A submarine like that could vanish beneath the sea and rise anywhere in the world to launch a strike no warning system would ever see coming. To Moscow, this was intolerable. If the Americans reached that capability first and alone, the Soviet Union would spend the next decade staring at a threat it had no way to answer. The fear was not abstract, and the race ran in both directions. Only a few years earlier, in 1957, the Soviet Union had stunned the world by launching the first artificial satellite into orbit, proof that Soviet rockets could now reach clear across the planet. For a time, it was the Americans who feared they had fallen behind, and each side pushed to press whatever advantage it held. The Americans led beneath the waves. The Soviets had shocked everyone with their rockets. A submarine that combined nuclear power with nuclear missiles was the place where those two contests met. It would carry the reach of a long-range missile down into the one place nothing could track it, the deep ocean, where no radar could find it and no surprise attack could catch it in the open. There was a deeper logic underneath the panic, the logic that defined the whole nuclear age. Missiles on land could be found and destroyed in a surprise attack. Bombers could be shot down. But a submarine hiding in the deep ocean was almost impossible to find, and if it survived a first strike, it could surface and strike back. A missile submarine was, in the cold arithmetic of that era, the ultimate insurance policy. It was the weapon that promised that no matter who fired first, the other side could still answer, and both nations would burn together. Whoever ruled the deep ocean held the last word in any war. The Soviet leadership was not only chasing prestige, they believed they were chasing survival, and they were willing to spend almost anything to get there, including the lives of the men they would put aboard. So the order came down. Build a nuclear missile submarine and build it fast. Speed was the priority. Speed over caution, speed over testing, speed over the safety of the sailors who would eventually crew the thing. The result was the first of a class the Soviets called Project 658, the class that the Western Alliance would come to label the Hotel class. She was given the designation K-19. She would carry 2 nuclear reactors and 3 ballistic missiles tipped with nuclear warheads. On paper, she was a triumph. In the shipyard, she was a nightmare. The construction was brutal and rushed, and the boat seemed to fight the men building her from the very start. Before she was even finished, 10 civilian workers and a sailor died in accidents during her construction. When the time came to launch her and bless her with the traditional bottle of champagne broken across the hull for luck, the Navy broke with custom and gave the task to a man instead of a woman. He swung the bottle at the steel. It did not break. It slid along the hull, bounced off the rubber coating, and stayed whole. To sailors in every navy on Earth, an unbroken christening bottle means one thing. The ship is unlucky. The ship is cursed. Over the next 2 years, she would spend her time proving it. The list of what went wrong with this submarine before her worst day reads like something out of a nightmare. On a deep test dive, water flooded into the reactor compartment and forced a violent emergency surfacing. On another occasion, the special rubber coating meant to keep her quiet peeled away from the hull and had to be entirely reapplied. The galley crew once dumped wooden crating into the waste system, clogged it, and flooded an entire compartment a third full of water. A reactor control rod was bent by mishandling during a shift change. While the missiles were being loaded, a heavy cover slammed shut and killed a sailor. Another man fell to his death between 2 compartments. An electrician was crushed by a missile tube door. And late in 1960, during her first independent voyage, a cooling pump failed and specialists had to be rushed out to repair her at sea. Each of these was survivable on its own. Together they told a single story. This was a boat that had been shoved into the water before she was ready, crewed largely by young men barely out of their teens, and sent out carrying weapons that could erase cities. By 1961, she was declared ready for service anyway. The pressure to deploy her had beaten the pressure to get her right, so she went to sea with a flaw buried deep inside her that no inspection had caught because the flaw was invisible, and because the people who knew a corner had been cut had chosen to stay silent. On this particular voyage, she was not at war. She was on a training exercise in the North Atlantic, rehearsing the kind of patrol she would carry out in a real conflict, running her drills far from home under the watchful eyes of her senior officers. Aboard were not only her fighting crew but missile specialists, reactor officers, torpedo men, doctors, cooks, and a handful of observers riding along to see how she performed. Most of the sailors were very young. For many of them, this was the great adventure of their lives, a berth aboard the newest and most secret ship in the entire fleet. Not one of them had been told that the boat beneath their feet carried a hidden fault, waiting for the wrong moment to open. Now we come to the true enemy in this story. It was not a country and it was not a captain. It was the reactor, or more precisely, the physics of the reactor married to the culture that built it. The heart of this submarine was a pair of pressurized water reactors, each able to produce around 70 megawatts of heat. Inside each one, uranium fuel was arranged so that a controlled chain reaction could take place, throwing off enormous heat, which was carried away by water held under tremendous pressure so that it would not boil. That superheated water flowed through exchangers, made steam, and the steam turned the turbines that drove the submarine through the sea. When it worked, it was an elegant and frightening machine, the power to run for weeks with no air and no fuel stops, drawn from the same reaction that powers a bomb. But that pressurized water was everything. It was the line between a power plant and a catastrophe. The entire design depended on keeping the water moving and keeping it under pressure. And this reactor carried a fatal weakness. There was no independent separate way to cool the core if the main system failed. In the American Navy, engineers were obsessed with backups, a second path and a third, so that no single failure could ever leave a core without coolant. This submarine had been built without that cushion. If the main cooling loop failed, there was no second plan. There was only the decay heat and the rising needle and the melting point of uranium waiting at the top of the scale. So how did the main loop fail? Here is where a tragedy starts to look like a crime. When the reactor was first started up, back on land, the construction crew made a mistake with the pressure instruments on the main cooling circuit. According to one senior Soviet naval officer who spoke about it years later, a pressure gauge that should have been connected was simply left off, and before anyone caught the error, the cooling pipes were subjected to a pressure of around 400 atmospheres, roughly double what they were ever meant to endure. That kind of overpressure does not always fail at once. It weakens metal. It can leave behind a tiny, invisible crack that holds for weeks or months and then lets go at the worst possible instant. There was a second explanation, the one the Navy would officially settle on, and it pointed to a welder. During construction, a worker had failed to use the protective cloths that were supposed to shield the piping from sparks. Droplets of hot metal touched a coolant pipe and left a microscopic flaw in the wall, a crack far too small to see. Whichever version holds more truth, and they may each hold a piece of it, the meaning is the same. The failure that would kill Boris Korchilov and 7 other men had been created on land in peacetime by workers who then handed the boat to the Navy and moved on to the next hull. The men who made the fault would never feel the heat. The men who inherited it were now standing at a door that glowed blue. In command that night was Captain Nikolai Zateyev, an experienced and hard-headed officer who had already privately doubted whether his boat was truly fit for war. Serving as his second-in-command, his executive officer was a quiet, thoughtful man in his mid-30s named Vasily Arkhipov. Hold that name in your mind, keep it there. Because Arkhipov was standing on that submarine, breathing that air, and what happened to him over the following days would ripple outward until it touched the whole human race. We will return to him. For now, he is simply the executive officer of a doomed submarine about to be poisoned along with everyone else aboard. And the crew's first responses, the trained, disciplined, by-the-book responses, all failed. They worked to understand the leak. The reactor crew found the rupture, but it sat in a place they could not simply reach and clamp shut. They tried to raise the pressure to force water back into motion. The needle did not care, it kept climbing. They confirmed the control rods were fully home and the chain reaction was dead. And it made no difference because decay heat needs no chain reaction to keep on burning. The automatic systems had done their jobs and their jobs were not enough. The one system that could have saved them had never been fitted. And they could not call for help because the long-range radio was silent. Think about what that meant for the men on that boat. Somewhere out there was the Soviet fleet. Somewhere out there, in fact, were American and Allied ships because this was a tense stretch of ocean in one of the tensest summers of the entire Cold War. Only a month earlier, the young American president and the Soviet leader had met face to face, and the meeting had gone badly, leaving both sides more frightened than before. The two superpowers were locked in a standoff over the divided city of Berlin, and the pressure was building toward the moment, a little more than 5 weeks after this night when a wall would rise across that city. Everyone was jumpy. Everyone was watching everyone else for the first sign of an attack, and into that atmosphere, a Soviet submarine armed with nuclear missiles was quietly heating toward a possible explosion a few hundred miles from coastlines, ringed with early warning stations. A sudden blast, a burst of radiation, an unexplained warship in distress near watched airspace. In the summer of 1961, there were few worse places and few worse moments for a nuclear accident. The crew was not only fighting for their own lives. Without knowing it, they were fighting to keep a private disaster from becoming a public one that the wrong people might misread. So the captain was left with a choice that no officer is ever trained to make. He could do nothing and watch the reactor melt down and very likely take the submarine and every man on it into the sea. Or he could send his sailors by hand into a compartment flooded with lethal radiation to build a cooling system that did not exist, out of parts never meant for the job in the handful of minutes each man could survive in there. There was no third path. There was no elegant escape. There was only the reactor, the heat, and the bodies of his crew. Zateyev chose to fight. The plan he and his engineers reached was so crude and so desperate that by rights it should not have worked at all. The idea was this. If they could not run water through the reactor's normal cooling loop, they would build a new one from scratch, right there in the compartment. They would take the submarine's own fresh water supply and force it into the reactor's cooling system through a pipe that was never designed to carry it. To do that, men would have to get inside the reactor compartment, cut away an air vent valve and weld a new water pipe onto the opening, creating by hand an improvised path for cooling water to reach the overheating core. If it worked, water would move through the core, drag the decay heat away, and pull the temperature back down before the fuel could melt. The physics of it was sound. A stream of cool water through the core would carry off the heat, and buy time. The problem was not the physics, the problem was the compartment. To do that welding, men would have to work inside a space now filled with radioactive steam and gas, where the radiation was so intense that a human being could survive only minutes before absorbing a dose that would kill him. There were no protective suits aboard capable of stopping it. There were only chemical rubber coats and gas masks which might keep some radioactive particles off a man's skin and out of his lungs, but which did nothing at all against the gamma radiation passing straight through his body and tearing apart the cells inside him. So Zateyev organized the work the only way it could be done. He split the volunteers into small groups, 3 men at a time, and sent each group into the compartment for only 5 to 10 minutes before pulling them out and sending in the next. It was an assembly line of sacrifice. Each man would go in, cut and weld as much as his body could bear, and come out. Then the next man. Then the next. The instruments meant to measure radiation exposure pegged at their highest reading almost at once and became useless. The men were working past the top of the scale. They were, in the most literal sense, absorbing doses that had no number. And the young engineers volunteered anyway. First among them was Boris Korshilov, the lieutenant we met at the very beginning, commander of one of the reactor control groups, 23 years old. He did not have to go. He volunteered and he led the first group down into the glow. Watch what those minutes cost. Korshilov's group climbed down into the reactor compartment. When they got their first look inside, they saw that blue shimmer clinging to the piping around the damaged reactor, and for a heartbeat, they thought a fire had broken out. It was not fire. It was the air charged by radiation. They went to work anyway. In that superheated, poisoned space, they began the near impossible task of cutting the vent valve and welding the new water pipe into place, passing tools in the cramped dark, racing against a clock measured not in the size of the job, but in how long a body could function before it started to die. Picture it the way the survivors remembered it. The compartment is tight and savagely hot, the reactor bleeding heat into the surrounding steel. The space is thick with steam and lit by that faint blue haze. The men work in rubber coats and fogged gas masks that half blind them, their hands slick and the torch throwing sparks in the gloom. No one can stay long enough to finish in a single pass, so the work has to be handed off, group to group, like men passing a burning weight from hand to hand because no one can hold it more than a few seconds. Outside the door, the captain and the executive officer count the minutes and pull each team out on schedule, then send in the next 3. Some of the men feel it before they even climb back out, the metallic taste, the dizziness, the first turn of nausea. Korshilov climbed back out of the compartment, pulled off his mask, and was immediately, violently ill. He had absorbed something on the order of 54 sieverts of radiation. To put that in scale, a dose of 4 to 5 sieverts taken quickly kills about half the people who receive it within a month. Korshilov had taken more than 10 times that amount. His fate was sealed the instant he came back through that door, and some part of him surely knew it as he went in. Then the next group went down, and the next. What happened in those hours is the part that is hardest to grasp from the safety of dry land. The men waiting their turn had just watched the first team come out sick and shaking. They understood, without anyone spelling it out for them, what the compartment was doing to a human body. And they went down anyway. No one had to be forced into that space. When each team was pulled back out on the captain's count, the next 3 stepped forward and climbed into the same glow, because the needle had not yet stopped, and because stopping meant losing the ship and everyone aboard her. 3 men at a time, 5 to 10 minutes each, welding and cutting and connecting, each team absorbing a dose that would eventually kill or cripple them, each team buying a few more minutes of progress on the makeshift loop. The steam pouring off the reactor carried radioactive fragments into the ventilation system, which spread them through the rest of the boat, so that even the men who never entered the compartment were being poisoned at their own stations. The whole crew was taking a dose. The whole submarine was becoming contaminated. Some of the radioactive particles even settled onto the nuclear missiles she carried. And slowly, one 5-minute shift at a time, the improvised system came together. The men finished the welds, they opened the flow. Fresh water began to move into the reactor's cooling system through a pipe no engineer had ever designed for it, rigged in the dark by dying men. The needle on the temperature gauge stopped climbing, and then it began to fall. The water was carrying the decay heat away. The crude, desperate, hand-built loop was working. The reactor, which had been minutes or hours from melting, began to cool. The fuel did not liquefy. The core did not breach. There was no explosion. In a compartment full of steam and radiation, using pipe and torch and their own poisoned hands, the crew had done the one thing that could save the ship, and they had done it in time. They had stopped a nuclear meltdown at sea with a welding torch and their own lives. But saving the reactor was not the same as saving themselves, and it was not the same as getting home. In the hours that followed, the fight shifted from physics to fear, distance, and the icy politics of the Cold War. The reactor was cooling, but the boat was crippled and contaminated, and the men who had done the work were beginning to sicken in front of everyone. Captain Zatayev made a decision that broke from his orders. Instead of continuing on the mission's planned route, he turned the submarine south, toward waters where he knew Soviet diesel-powered submarines were operating, gambling that he could reach friendly vessels and get his dying men off the boat. Then he faced a second danger that had nothing to do with radiation. His crew was young and terrified, watching shipmates collapse, trapped on a poisoned submarine that many of them believed was going to kill them all. He feared they might break, might rise up in panic. So he made a cold, hard choice. He ordered nearly all of the small arms aboard thrown into the sea, keeping back only 5 pistols, which he handed to the officers he trusted most. His executive officer, Vasily Arkhipov, backed him in it. If the crew came apart, the captain and a handful of loyal officers would still hold the boat. That is how close to the edge things were. The men who had just saved everyone were now disarmed, in case they shattered. As the crippled submarine limped south on the surface, her weak short-range distress calls went out across the water, and here the Cold War pressed in directly. According to the accounts of the men aboard, American ships in the area picked up those signals and closed in, offering help. An American aircraft even circled and photographed the wounded Soviet boat. For the freezing, sickened crew, help was right there within reach. Zatayev refused it. He would not accept American assistance because this submarine was one of the most secret weapons in the Soviet arsenal, and letting the Americans near her risked handing over the crown jewels of Soviet naval technology. So the captain waved off the only immediate help on the horizon and kept steering for his own fleet, choosing secrecy over the fastest road to a hospital. It tells you everything about the war these men were fighting. Even in the middle of a nuclear accident with his sailors dying, the captain's orders and instincts said Soviet secrets mattered more than the fastest rescue. At last, the submarine made contact with a Soviet diesel boat, designated S-270, which had heard the faint distress calls and come to find her. That boat reported the accident to the fleet, and the evacuation began. The most heavily poisoned men, Korchilov among them, were transferred across to the rescue submarine and then carried onward, rushed toward home and toward a specialized hospital in Moscow, where the country's leading experts on radiation injury would try, and mostly fail, to save them. The submarine herself was taken under tow and hauled back toward the Kola Peninsula in the Soviet Arctic. The immediate crisis was over. The reactor was cool. The boat was saved. But the voyage home was its own slow horror. The entire submarine was contaminated. The radioactive steam that had poured off the reactor during the repairs had been pulled into the ventilation and carried compartment to compartment until there was no truly safe place left aboard. The men who never went near the reactor, the missile technicians, the cooks, the radio operators, the young sailors at their posts had all been absorbing radiation simply by breathing the ship's air and standing on her decks. The healthy were sickening. The heroes were dying in front of them, and there was nothing to do but hold on, keep the makeshift loop fed, and wait for the distance to close, mile by mile, while the men who had welded the pipe grew visibly worse by the hour. When the rescue finally came and the crew was taken off, they carried the accident with them, in their blood and their bones, every single one of them. The reckoning was only beginning. For the 8 members of the engineering crew who had done the welding, the 7 engineers and their divisional officer, there was no recovery. They had absorbed doses in the range of 5,000 to 6,000 rem, far beyond anything a human body can endure. What followed was a countdown measured in days. From the moment of exposure, the time each of the 8 had left, counted in days, ran roughly like this: 6, 6, 6, 8, 9, 11, 16, and 19. Boris Korchilov was the first to die 6 days after he climbed out of that door on the 10th of July, 1961, in a hospital in Moscow. Within about 3 weeks, all 8 of them were gone, killed by acute radiation sickness. It is worth understanding what that death is because it explains why the men who watched it never forgot it. A massive dose of radiation does not kill quickly or cleanly. It works at the level of the cell, destroying the systems that constantly rebuild the body, the marrow that makes blood, the lining of the gut, the machinery of repair. There is often a strange, false calm in the first day or two, a window in which a man might even seem to recover before the collapse begins. There was almost nothing the doctors of that era could do for a dose that size. The 8 engineers had been sentenced the moment they entered the compartment, and the sentence was carried out over the days that followed, in hospital beds far from the sea. Their names deserve to be spoken because for 30 years almost no one was permitted to speak them. Boris Korchilov, Boris Rizhikov, Yuri Ordochkin, Evgeny Kashenkov, Semyon Penkov, Nikolai Savkin, Valery Kharitonov, Yuri Povstiev. 8 men, most of them young, who walked into a dose without a number so that more than 100 others could live. And they were not the last to die. Over the following 2 years, 14 more members of the crew died of radiation-related illness. The slower deaths, the cancers and organ failures that came for the men who had taken lower but still devastating doses. In all, around 22 men from the original crew died because of that single night. Many more survived only through brutal treatment. A Soviet professor of medicine devised a desperate course of care for the worst cases, one that included bone marrow transplants and repeated blood transfusions, and against long odds, it saved some of them. 2 officers in particular, a lieutenant named Mikhail Krasichkov and a captain named Vladimir Yenin, had absorbed doses that were considered certain to be fatal and were pulled back from death by that treatment. Others survived as well, but carried the damage inside them for decades, in chest pain, in numbness, in the cancers that would surface years down the line. Then came the silence. Because this was the Soviet Union at the peak of the Cold War, and this submarine was a top-secret weapon, the whole disaster was buried under layers of state secrecy. The men who had saved the boat were forbidden to tell anyone what they had done. The official medical record given to the poisoned survivors was not radiation sickness. It was written down as something vague and almost insulting, a nervous disorder, a bureaucratic fiction meant to keep the truth off the paperwork. The crew was sworn to secrecy under threat of harsh punishment, and for years afterward the survivors had to lie to their own doctors during routine checkups, hiding the real cause of illnesses that were slowly killing them. When men died in the months and years that followed, their deaths were often recorded as something else entirely. Other diseases, anything but the radiation that had actually done it. A man could give his life to prevent a nuclear catastrophe and then have the cause of his death falsified, so the state would never have to admit the catastrophe had nearly happened at all. The dead were buried in secret. Because their bodies were radioactive, the men were sealed in lead-lined coffins and buried quietly, and even their families were not told where the graves were. In one of the most haunting details of the whole affair, the location of one of those secret graves was discovered only by accident years later, when a surviving crewman came to bury a relative and stumbled upon the plain, unmarked headstones of his own shipmates. For the families, that secrecy became its own long wound. Wives and parents were handed vague explanations and told almost nothing of what their men had done or why they had died. Some spent years not even knowing where their sons and husbands lay buried. A sailor could disappear into a hospital, die of a cause no one would name aloud, and be lowered into an unmarked grave, and the people who loved him were left to grieve around an empty space where the truth should have been. And the recognition these men had earned was denied to them from the very top of the Soviet state. Zateyev recommended that Korchilov receive the highest honor his country could give, but the Soviet leader is said to have brushed the idea aside with a chilling line. He said, in effect, that they did not hand out awards for accidents. In the end, some of the crew were quietly decorated by secret order, and Korchilov was given a high honor after his death. But the awards were classified, hidden, handed out in the dark to match a disaster the state refused to admit had occurred. The boat carried the poison home with her. When she was towed back to port, she contaminated the ground around her. Repair crews spent the next 2 years cutting out and replacing her ruined reactors, and in doing so exposed themselves and the surrounding land to still more radiation. The 2 damaged reactors, still loaded with their spent fuel, were eventually hauled north and dumped into the shallow waters of a bay in the Kara Sea in the Soviet Arctic, out of sight and out of mind, following the grim habit of the age. They are still down there today. The crew gave their submarine a nickname that captured exactly what she had become to them. They called her Hiroshima, and she seemed determined to earn it. The reactor accident was not the end of her curse. It was only the most famous chapter. In November of 1969, while submerged in the Barents Sea, she collided head-on with an American attack submarine called the Gato, which had been shadowing her in the endless underwater cat-and-mouse game the two navies played beneath the Arctic. The impact smashed in her bow. Both boats survived, but Soviet specialists later concluded that had she been moving just a few knots faster, she would have cut the American submarine in half, an event that, in that climate of suspicion, could have been catastrophically misread. Then, in February of 1972, far out in the Atlantic, a fire broke out aboard her when hydraulic fluid sprayed onto a hot surface and ignited. Toxic smoke swept through the boat. 28 men died in that fire, with 2 more dying afterward. And in one of the most harrowing survival stories of the Cold War, 12 sailors were sealed into the aft torpedo compartment, cut off by the fire, and survived there in the cold and the dark, without heat or light, for 24 days before they could finally be rescued. The Hiroshima had killed again. For 30 years, the outside world knew none of it. Western intelligence heard rumors, but no details. It was not until 1991, as the Soviet Union itself was collapsing, that a Soviet newspaper finally confirmed in public that radiation had killed many of this submarine's crew. For 3 decades, these men and their sacrifice had, as far as the wider world was concerned, simply not existed. They had prevented a catastrophe, and their reward was to be erased. For the men who lived, and for the families of the men who died, the story did not end with survival. It hardened into a long, quiet struggle to be remembered at all. Boris Korchilov, the young officer who led the first team into the glow, was eventually reburied in a cemetery in his home city, and his old school later placed a memorial in his honor. There is even a street named for him in a naval town in the Russian Arctic. But those honors came late, long after the state that sent him into that reactor had spent decades pretending nothing had happened. Captain Zateyev survived, endured months of treatment, and lived on for decades, carrying both the physical damage and the memory of what he had ordered his men to do. He kept the story alive, and he kept pushing for his crew to be recognized. In his later years, when he was finally free to speak, he described what recognition had actually amounted to with a bitterness that held no self-pity at all. A commission had declared him a hero and decorated the crew, he said, but afterward the men received no real support, only what he called valuable gifts. And then he named the gift, flatly, without irony, watches. The men who stopped a nuclear meltdown with their bodies were thanked, in the end, with wristwatches. Zateyev never dressed the story up. He carried to the end of his life the memory of walking Korchilov to that door and asking him if he understood where he was going. It would take until the 21st century for the wider world to try to give these men their due. In 2006, the last leader of the Soviet Union wrote to the committee that awards the Nobel Peace Prize, proposing that the crew of this submarine be nominated in recognition of what they had done that night, preventing a disaster that could have poisoned the sea and, far worse, could have been mistaken for something even more dangerous. Zateyev himself was formally put forward. He was not alive to see it. He had died in 1998. By then, the men of this boat had finally begun to be remembered in the open. On the 4th of July, 1998, exactly 37 years to the day after the accident, a monument to the fallen crew was unveiled at a cemetery in Moscow, a stone marked with the silhouette of a submarine and the names of the men the state had once buried in secret. And the reason most of the world knows this story at all is that in 2002, an American filmmaker made a movie about the accident, with well-known actors playing versions of the captain and his officers. The film took liberties, and some of the surviving crew objected to how their story was dramatized. But it did something the Soviet state had spent 30 years preventing. It said the names out loud. It put the sacrifice on screens around the world. The submarine herself sailed on in the fleet for many more years before she was finally retired at the start of the 1990s and laid up. In time, she was towed away to be broken apart for scrap. But her story did not vanish with her steel. One of the men who had served aboard her as a young conscript bought a section of the old hull and preserved it so that a piece of the boat they called Hiroshima still exists above the water, in the daylight, no longer a thing to be buried and denied, but a thing that can be seen and remembered. And now we come back to the executive officer, to the name I asked you to hold on to, because the story of Vasily Arkhipov turns a single Cold War submarine disaster into one of the strangest and most important chains of events in modern history. Remember where he was on that night off Greenland. Arkhipov was the second in command of this submarine. He lived through the meltdown. He breathed the poisoned air. He watched young men walk into the reactor and come out dying. He backed his captain even to the point of disarming the crew. He survived, and he was irradiated with everyone else aboard. And then he went back to sea. A little over a year later, in October of 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than it ever has. Before or since. It was the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States had discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, and the American president had thrown a naval blockade around the island. Into that blockade sailed a group of 4 Soviet diesel-electric submarines, sent secretly across the Atlantic. And here is the detailed history very nearly lost. Each of those submarines carried a nuclear-armed torpedo, and under certain conditions the officers aboard were authorized to use it. Vasily Arkhipov was aboard one of those boats, the submarine designated B-59. He was the chief of staff of the entire group, and he happened to be sailing on that particular vessel. On the 27th of October, 1962, American warships found the B-59 and began dropping practice depth charges, meant to force the submarine to surface, not to destroy it. But the men trapped inside did not know that. They had been submerged a long time, cut off from Moscow in stifling heat, with the air turning foul and the batteries failing, and now explosions were hammering against their hull. The captain, convinced that war had already broken out and that they were under attack, wanted to launch the nuclear torpedo at the American fleet. On nearly every other submarine in that group, the decision to fire would have required the agreement of only 2 officers. But this boat was different, because Arkhipov, as chief of staff of the whole group, was aboard. Launching the nuclear torpedo required the agreement of 3 men. The captain wanted to fire. The political officer agreed, and Vasily Arkhipov said no. He argued. He held his ground in that hot, dying submarine while charges rattled the hull and his captain insisted the war had come. He reasoned that the Americans were trying to force them to the surface, not to sink them, and that firing a nuclear weapon would guarantee the very disaster they all feared. Because the rules on that one boat demanded his consent, his refusal was enough. The torpedo was not fired. The submarine surfaced, and a nuclear exchange that might have escalated into global war, into the deaths of hundreds of millions of people, did not happen. The director of an American National Security Archive would later put it as plainly as it can be put. He said that a man named Vasily Arkhipov saved the world, and that is not empty praise. Consider what a single nuclear detonation among the American fleet would likely have set off. The United States would almost certainly have concluded that the Soviet Union had begun a nuclear war, and the war plans of that era did not call for a measured response. They called for an immediate, massive nuclear strike, which the Soviets would have answered in kind, wiping out cities across 2 continents in an afternoon. The American Defense Secretary of that era said years later that the 2 nations had come far closer to catastrophe than anyone realized at the time. One of the president's own historians called it not merely the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, but the most dangerous moment in all of human history. And at the pivot of that moment, in a sweltering submarine below the Caribbean, sat one irradiated Soviet officer saying a single quiet word: no. Now hold both moments in your mind at once. In 1961, Arkhipov stood on this submarine and watched what happens when a nuclear reactor slips beyond human control. Watched young men die to stop it, and absorbed the poison himself. A little over a year later, he sat in another submarine on another ocean with a nuclear weapon effectively in reach, being told that war had started, and he was the one man who refused. It is impossible to know for certain what moved him in the Caribbean, but it is not hard to imagine that a man who had already seen up close exactly what these weapons do to human flesh understood something the men shouting to fire did not. The accident that killed the crew of this submarine also forged the man who refused to end the world, and in the end, it collected him too. Vasily Arkhipov died in 1998 of kidney cancer, a disease of the kind linked to radiation exposure, and many believe it traced back to the dose he took aboard this boat in 1961. The submarine reached across nearly 40 years and claimed him. He received almost no recognition in his lifetime. Only long after his death did the world begin to understand what he had done. His widow once said simply that the man who prevented a nuclear war was a Russian submariner and that she was proud of her husband, always. Let me be honest with you about the history here, because this channel does not deal in myths. The full drama of Archipov's refusal aboard the B-59 rests largely on the testimony of participants and on accounts gathered decades afterward, and historians still debate exactly how the decision unfolded. What is not in dispute is that he was aboard this submarine during the 1961 accident, that he was irradiated, that he was aboard the B-59 during the depth charging in 1962, and that his consent would have been required to launch. The chain of events is real. The weight it carries is real. The reactors that nearly destroyed this submarine are still on the floor of the Kara Sea, dumped there in the 1960s, and that sea now holds more radioactive waste than anywhere else in the world's oceans. The remains of other reactors, an entire scuttled submarine, spent fuel from a nuclear icebreaker, all of it lowered into shallow Arctic water under the same logic of out of sight, out of mind. In 2021, a Russian expedition located the exact resting place of this boat's dumped reactors, and specialists began cautiously to ask whether they could ever be raised before they corrode and leak into one of the most fragile marine environments on Earth. The men who fixed the leak have been dead for more than 60 years. The thing they were fixing is still radioactive on the sea bottom. There is a reason this story reaches past its own decade. 25 years after this reactor overheated, another Soviet reactor slipped beyond the control of the men who ran it at a power station called Chernobyl, and that time there was no small team that could contain it by hand. The same instinct that had rushed a flawed submarine to sea and then classified the deaths of her crew was still at work. This boat was the warning the system chose not to hear, and beneath the oceans right now, nuclear-powered submarines are on patrol under many flags, each one a floating reactor, many of them carrying nuclear arms, crewed by people who are one cracked pipe, one bad weld, one missing backup, away from a version of the night Boris Korchilov walked into the light. The engineering is far better now. The backups are real. The safety culture in most navies has improved beyond recognition. But the hard truth at the center of it has not changed. You cannot switch off a reactor and walk away. The heat keeps coming. And in the last extremity, the final line of defense is still what it was in the North Atlantic that night: the training, the discipline, and sometimes the sacrifice of the people aboard. The fault that nearly caused a nuclear disaster at sea was built into this submarine on dry land in peacetime by men racing a clock, and then it was hidden by a system that could not admit its own mistakes. It should have ended with a molten core, a lost boat, and 3 nuclear missiles scattered across the ocean floor. It did not end that way for one reason. 8 men were willing to walk into a dose that had no number, 5 minutes at a time, and build a cooling system with their own hands and their own lives. They stopped the meltdown. Then they died for it, in the order the radiation chose. And standing among them was a quiet executive officer who would carry that night in his body for the rest of his days, and who, a little over a year later, on another sea, would be the single human being standing between a crisis and the end of the world, and would say no. He may well have said it because, unlike the men urging him to fire, he had already seen with his own eyes exactly what such a weapon does. A leader once said his country did not give awards for accidents. But the crew of the submarine they called Hiroshima were never really victims of an accident. They were the answer to a question the Cold War kept asking of both sides. What happens when a nation builds a weapon it cannot fully control and then asks ordinary men to control it anyway? For 6 days, and then for 2 years, and then through 30 years of silence, that crew gave their answer. They walked into the light. And because they did, the rest of us are still here to remember them.